Nobody warns you about this. But there are words, specific words, that are quietly shutting down your prayers before they ever reach heaven. Not sins, not failures. Words. Padre Pio knew this with a certainty that no theologian could teach him. For 50 years in that small confessional in San Giovanni Rotondo, he listened to thousands of souls pour out their hearts to God and watched their own mouths undo everything their prayers were trying to build. People who prayed daily, people who fasted, people who loved God deeply and genuinely. And yet something in the way they spoke was working against everything they were asking for. He would sit there and listen, and he would hear it, not just the words spoken in confession, but the words that lived underneath, the ones people said without thinking, the ones repeated so often they no longer sounded dangerous. And before they finished speaking, he already knew why the prayers were not landing. He leaned forward one afternoon with a man who had been praying for the same breakthrough for 11 years. The man had done everything right, everything except one thing. And Padre Pio told him, quietly, without accusation, that the very words coming out of his mouth every day were closing the door he was begging God to open. The man went pale. Not because it was strange, because it was true. What Padre Pio identified in that confessional, and repeated to soul after soul across 5 decades, will change the way you pray, the way you speak, and the way you expect God to move in your life. And what he said those 3 words were, is something almost no one who prays every day has ever been told directly. But what Padre Pio was about to reveal was not simply a lesson about positive thinking or careful speech. It went far deeper than that. It touched something that most people who pray every single day will never connect to the reason their prayers feel like they are hitting a ceiling. Because here is what almost no one understands about Padre Pio. He did not arrive at this from study alone. He arrived at it from sight. From 50 years of watching the invisible world respond, or fail to respond, to the words human beings spoke in faith, in doubt, in habit, and in fear. He saw the connection between the mouth and the miracle with a clarity that no seminary could produce. For decades, from that confessional that became one of the most visited places in the world, Padre Pio watched the same pattern repeat itself without exception. Souls that prayed sincerely but spoke destructively. Words that felt harmless on the surface but carried a weight in the spiritual realm that most people never considered. Words so common, so embedded in daily conversation, that no one ever stopped to question what they were actually doing. To understand why what he identified carries the authority it does, you first need to understand what kind of man was doing the identifying. He was not giving a motivational talk. He was reporting what he observed in the unseen, with 50 years of evidence behind every word. That is not a background detail. That is everything. And that is exactly what I am going to show you now. There was something about Padre Pio that simply had no equivalent among the men of his generation. He was not a biblical scholar with academic titles. He was not a church politician with institutional power. He was a Capuchin friar from a small poor town in southern Italy who had asked God for one thing, to suffer in his place for the salvation of souls. And what God deposited inside that man in return was so thoroughly documented, so consistently witnessed, and so impossible to explain away that even the Vatican's own investigators, sent specifically to discredit him, came back without a case. This is not legend. It is on record. Thousands of pages of official Vatican investigation files. Sworn testimonies from medical doctors who examined his wounds under controlled conditions and could offer no natural explanation for why they bled for 50 years without infection, without deterioration, and according to multiple independent witnesses, carried the fragrance of flowers rather than the smell of decay. Letters from cardinals, testimonies from bishops, accounts from ordinary men and women who walked into that confessional as skeptics and walked out as witnesses. But none of that is the most important part for what you are about to hear. The most important part is what Padre Pio could see that no one else could. People from different countries, different decades, who had never spoken to one another, reported the same thing independently. He knew their names before they introduced themselves. He identified sins that had never been spoken out loud. He described the interior condition of souls with a precision that left no room for guesswork. Soldiers from both world wars recorded his appearance on the battlefield in locations where his physical body was documented elsewhere. Military accounts, with no religious agenda behind them. These were not stories passed down through devotion. They were independent testimonies converging on the same impossible conclusion, that this man saw things the rest of the world could not. And that is exactly why, when Padre Pio identified the specific words that block prayer, he was not offering an opinion. He was delivering a report from the unseen, with 50 years of evidence, from a man who watched the invisible world operate up close for longer than most people pray in an entire lifetime. He was not describing what he believed. He was describing what he witnessed. And now I am going to show you exactly what that was. The teaching Padre Pio returned to with quiet but unmistakable urgency. In the confessional, in his letters, in the private conversations those closest to him recorded for generations, was this: your prayers are not being ignored, they are being blocked. And the block is coming from your own mouth, not from great acts of rebellion, not from deliberate rejection of God, from words, specific words spoken so habitually, so automatically, so innocently that the soul that speaks them never stops to consider what they are actually declaring in the spiritual realm. This may sound too simple to be the real answer, but Padre Pio understood something about the power of spoken words that most people only grasp in theory and never apply in practice. Words are not neutral. They are not just sounds. They carry agreement. And whatever your mouth consistently agrees with, your life begins to move toward, regardless of what your prayers are asking for in the opposite direction. A prayer asking God to open a door, followed immediately by words that declare the door is permanently shut. That is not faith reaching heaven. That is a house divided. And Padre Pio saw this pattern destroy the prayer lives of sincere, devoted, genuinely faithful people, not because they were weak, but because they were unaware. The 3 words he identified were not exotic. They were not complicated. They were ordinary, familiar. Words spoken millions of times a day by people who love God and have no idea what those words are doing every time they leave the mouth. The first is, I can't. The second is, it's impossible. The third is, I'll never. Each one sounds like honesty. Each one feels like realism. But Padre Pio called them something else entirely. He called them agreements with the enemy dressed in the language of humility. Because every time a mouth says what God has already said he can do cannot be done, that mouth is not being realistic. It is choosing a side, and it is choosing the wrong one. When a soul ignores this, it prays with one hand and pushes the answer back with the other. It asks God to move while its words declare that movement is impossible. And that contradiction, held long enough, does not just delay the blessing. It trains the soul to stop expecting it altogether. And now I am going to show you exactly how each of these 3 words operates, and why almost everyone who carries them never recognizes the damage they are doing in real time. The first word Padre Pio identified, and the one he heard most often in that confessional, was I can't. It sounds like self-awareness. It sounds like humility. It sounds like an honest assessment of human limitation. But Padre Pio heard something else underneath it entirely. He heard a declaration spoken not just to another person, but into the spiritual atmosphere, that what God has promised is beyond reach, that the provision is real, but the access is not, that heaven is willing, but the soul standing in front of it is not capable of receiving. And he would stop people mid-sentence when he heard it, not harshly, quietly. And he would remind them of what Paul wrote in Philippians, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, not some things, all things. Padre Pio said that every time a believer says I can't about something God has already covered, that believer is not being honest. They are being faithless without realizing it. And faithlessness, spoken consistently out loud, builds a wall between the soul and the answer it is asking for. The remedy he prescribed was direct. Replace I can't with I can't alone, but God can through me. That single shift, practiced daily, begins to dismantle the wall one word at a time. The second word was, it's impossible. This one, Padre Pio said, is the most spiritually dangerous of the 3, because it sounds the most reasonable. When circumstances look impossible, saying so feels like facing reality. But Padre Pio had witnessed too many impossibilities dissolve in the presence of faith to have any patience for that reasoning. He pointed to the words of Jesus in Matthew, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. He said that every time a believer declares something impossible, they are setting a boundary on God that God himself never agreed to. They are telling heaven what heaven cannot do. And heaven, Padre Pio said, does not argue with you. It simply waits. It waits for the mouth to align with what the Spirit already knows is available. He told souls in the confessional that the word impossible was the enemy's favorite word, because once a person believes something is impossible, they stop praying for it. They stop expecting it. They stop positioning themselves to receive it. And the blessing that was already prepared sits unclaimed. The remedy is to replace. It's impossible with nothing is impossible with God. And to say it out loud, especially when it feels least true. The third word was, I'll never. This one operates differently from the other two. It is not about present limitation or current circumstances. It is a declaration about the future, a permanent closing of a door that God may be preparing to open. I'll never be healed. I'll never get out of this. I'll never see that prayer answered. Padre Pio said these words with particular gravity because he had seen what they do over time. They do not just express hopelessness. They plant it. Every repetition drives the declaration deeper into the soul until the person no longer prays for the thing they said they would never receive. They have already decided. And a soul that has already decided against its own miracle will not recognize the miracle when it arrives. He pointed to Abraham, a man who had every human reason to say, I'll never have a son. Old age, a barren wife, decades of silence from heaven. And yet Romans says he did not waver in unbelief but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God. Padre Pio said that Abraham's secret was not his circumstances, it was his mouth. He kept declaring what God had promised even when everything visible said otherwise. The remedy is to refuse the word never in the context of what God has promised, and to replace every I'll never with God's timing is not finished yet. He said this clearly and repeatedly to every soul that left his confessional still speaking against their own prayers. Watch your mouth as closely as you watch your behavior. Guard your words as carefully as you guard your actions. Because what you declare daily, you invite. What you agree with consistently, you move toward. And what you speak against your own faith, you slowly destroy. He promised that when a person began to take their words as seriously as their prayers, they would discover that the ceiling they thought was God's silence was something they had built themselves, one word at a time. And now I am going to show you what changes when that ceiling finally comes down. That man who had been praying for 11 years for the same breakthrough, the one who sat across from Padre Pio in that confessional in San Giovanni Rotondo and heard something he had never expected to hear, left that room different. Not because Padre Pio gave him a new prayer strategy, not because he prescribed a new devotion or a longer fast, but because he named the exact thing that was working against every prayer that man had ever lifted to heaven. 3 words, spoken daily, in complete sincerity, completely unaware of what they were doing. And the moment they were named, something shifted. Not in the circumstances yet, in the mouth, in the awareness, in the way that man would speak from that day forward. Padre Pio himself never spoke those words, not under 50 years of suffering, not under Vatican suspicion, not under physical pain that would have broken most men within a year. He kept his mouth aligned with heaven, even when heaven felt silent, even when the circumstances screamed impossibility, even when every visible sign pointed toward never. And the fruit of that discipline, that relentless, costly, daily discipline of guarding what his mouth declared, is visible in the lives of millions of people across every continent who were touched by what flowed through him. He did not just teach this, he lived it every single day for 50 years. And the question his life leaves for anyone who is paying attention right now is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. How many of your prayers have you been canceling with your own words without ever realizing it? The question is not whether you recognize those 3 words in your own mouth. The question is what you are going to do the next time they rise up, and whether you will let them leave or stop them before they do. If this video helped you see something you had not seen before, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like. Because messages like this need to reach every soul that is praying faithfully and wondering why heaven feels silent, and your support is what makes that possible.